It's been an honor to be here with you. I met your pastor about 1995. I was quite a bit better looking back then. He hasn't changed much, Pastor Sergey, but it's an honor to see what God is doing in your midst. And Brother George, that was awesome. It's almost as if God spoke. How many of you know sometimes when somebody's going to come and speak, God prepares the way? Amen? And so God spoke to George and said, talk about worship. Because I want to talk about worship as well. I want to worship Jesus today by sharing a story with you. And I do this because I honor him. I worship him for who he is. It's a story that I heard growing up as a little kid. I was not born in the United States. I was born in Paraguay, in South America. Por eso yo hablo muy poquito en español también. Tacos, enchiladas, things like that. Or Taco Bell, or as Mexicans call it, Taco Hell. But anyway, so I speak a little bit of Spanish. Being born in South America, we came to America in 1956 when I was 2.5 years old. So if you know your math right now, I'm about 39. But anyway, moving on very quickly. I was the oldest son born in South America. I have an older sister that was born there, another brother, and then 3 more siblings were born in San Francisco. We were quite poor at the time. We're kind of the first immigration of Russians, the Ukrainians that came to the States. Quite poor. We didn't know we were poor, though, as a family, because my mom was probably the best cook God ever created, besides your mother. But my mother always prepared good food. My dad worked very hard. We always had a place to live, but we didn't know we were poor. We did not own a TV when we were little kids. I read every Hardy Boys book I can get my hands on. That was my entertainment. And my entertainment was waiting for my daddy to come home every evening. Because after my father and mother would come home, my mom would make dinner, then it would be time to go to sleep. And my dad would collect all the kids, 3, 4, eventually 6 of us, place us on a nice, warm, down comforter in San Francisco. And every evening he would pray for us. But right before he would pray, he would share a little story. And this story changed my life, transformed my life. As a little child, I began to worship this Jesus. And I think it's probably a question we have, many of us raising our kids today. How do you raise a generation that worships Jesus for who he is, rather than worry? My wife gave me this little statement right after George said that, about what he said. She said, when we worry, we advertise the unreliability of God, and we say we can do it without God. Isn't that interesting? So how do you raise a generation that's not just worrying, but worshiping Jesus for who he is? Let me tell you how my daddy did it with me, okay? And it literally transformed my life, and I think it'll speak to you very clearly this morning as well. You see, my daddy would share tiny little snippet little stories, but they were not stories he made up. They were tiny little snippets of his own life story. But he was such a good storyteller, we would always, as little children, say, "Tell us more, Daddy." We didn't want to go to sleep. "Tell us more, please, Daddy." And he would always say, "Tomorrow." And we couldn't wait for tomorrow. So when tomorrow would come, we couldn't wait for Daddy to tell us a little bit more about his own life story. And unfortunately, many of us growing up don't know the stories of our past. Many of us don't, and it's too bad. So here's the story that my dad shared with us. Literally, as I grew up, I heard it so many times that it literally became part of my DNA, part of my blood, and it changed my life. The story starts kind of way back there. When I'm telling this to young people, I say it starts way back in 1917. There was a revolution in Russia. It was called the Bolshevik, or the Communist Revolution, and it was started by Lenin. A lot of young people go, "John Lennon, is that old?" No, not John Lennon. Vladimir Iliyn Lenin. It was the Communist Revolution. You all know about that. Some terrible things happened. But in the midst of that, there were Christians all over Ukraine and Russia because of one young man. Many of you may not know this in Russian history, by the name of Ivan Vodanayev. God spoke to him when he was a young man after the Azusa Street revival to go back to Ukraine, and God used him to ignite a huge revival that swept through Ukraine and into Russia. And into that revival were swept my grandparents. How many of you know when I get to heaven, the first neck I'm going to hug, if they have necks in heaven, is Ivan Vodanayev? Because I'm going to thank him. Because of his obedience, my grandparents became Christians. Again, there's the story about that is phenomenal. I don't have time to tell you. It's actually in my book. But after they became Christians, brand new Christians, they were poor farmers living north of Odessa in Ukraine. They didn't own very much. But my grandfather became a Christian, and God began to speak to him and said, Yaakov, sell everything that you have. I'm going to lead you to a distant country. God didn't even tell him where. God said, simply trust me. And my grandfather trusted God as a young Christian man, sold everything that he had. All the people in the little village knew him, and they said, Yaakov, what are you doing? Are you nuts? He said, what? They said, why did you sell everything? Well, God told me to do it. Why? He said he's going to lead us to a distant country. Where? He didn't tell us. But he said, you can come with us as well, because if you obey God, you'll avoid a huge disaster that's going to hit our village. Of course, nobody else came. Within a year, the communists came and burnt the village to the ground. My grandfather and his family of 3 kids at the time, my dad was not born, went out of Ukraine and went to the east around to Georgia, Batumi. You know where that is, Georgia, Batumi? My father would be born in Batumi, Georgia. This would be in 1927 is when they left. My father would be born in 28. From there, they went across to Baku, Azerbaijan, around the Caspian Sea, right on through Central Asia, through Kazakhstan to Almaty, to a tiny little town right next to the Chinese border. It used to be called Zharkent. Today, it's called Panfilov. That little journey I just spoke about there took 4.5 years. By the time the story begins at the border there of China, my father is 4.5 years old. Now, my dad is telling us these stories, and I still remember when I was researching my book, I said, Dad, how did you remember these things? You remember things that happened when you were 4 years? I can't remember what I did yesterday. And he says, son, when something like this happens in your life, you'll never forget it. And he said, son, I remember while my dad told me the story, when we walked into this town, we knew nobody. It was right on the border of China. Most people were coming to that little town because they were trying to escape into China. No communism yet there. He said, when we came to this town, we knew nobody, but we met a couple of Christians. And we told the Christians, this is what God said to us. And they were stunned. That's exactly what God said to us. So they formed a group of about 46 people. That's why I know a lot more of the story. And they were meeting in a building, waiting on God, praying, working in the little town there. The town was comprised of mainly Kazakh people, which are a Turkic minority Muslim people. There were police dogs roaming the streets with policemen looking for groups that were plotting to escape into China. So there was just a lot of mayhem. And they would be waiting on God, praying. And my dad said, I remember one day my dad comes home from work and says, children, tomorrow God is going to lead us to a land where there's white bread and honey. My dad had never eaten white bread before. He only ate black Russian coarse bread. And he had heard of honey, though he'd never tasted it before. So he couldn't imagine a land of having white bread and honey. But his daddy said, don't tell anybody we're going, because if the police find out, they'll throw your daddy into prison. The next day, they walked out, all the different families going to this building so that they could be waiting on God. And my daddy said they approached the building. They went into the building, waiting, praying. They're not singing loud because the police are roaming the streets. It's already the afternoon. The kids are getting restless. And God begins to speak prophetically to them and says something like this, children, trust me. I'm going to lead you out tonight. And when I lead you out, I want you to walk through the middle of this town, shouting praises to my name loudly. Have you ever had God say something to you and you're going, impossible? And God says, amen, for you, not for me. And then God even said something like this, I'm going to lead you out by 1 in the morning. It was that specific. Now, I know people that were 16 years old at that time. One of them would become our pastor of a church in San Francisco many years later. So I know the story from other sources. And they said at about 12 midnight, suddenly a huge storm hit this little town. And there were people all over the town, and they all disappeared, including the dogs. They all disappeared. And God spoke prophetically, children, now. And I'm told they opened that door, formed a single file line 2 blocks long, walked through the middle of that town, shouting praises to God's name. And nobody heard them except God as he thundered his approval. And when they came to the outskirts of the town, they heard the bell behind them tolling 1 in the morning. It was that specific. Now, they began praying because there were no signs that said, China, this way. So I don't know what you do when you need guidance, but they fell on their knees, they began to pray. And God began to speak to them. The elders appointed younger leaders to lead the group. They'd come to a fork in the road. This was a desert area, cold at night, hot during the daytime. They'd travel at night. During the daytime, they would sleep in bulrush grasses so nobody would catch them, especially the border guards. And as they would be trekking through the desert, they'd hit these dirt roads, and suddenly it would split to the right, to the left. They wouldn't know where to go. It was pitch dark. They'd begin to pray, and God would speak to the elders, and they would tell the younger leaders, God said turn right, God said turn left. That's how he led them through the desert. Now, please understand, I'm 5, 6, 7 years old, sitting on that down comforter, hearing these stories. What do you think is happening in my mind? And then God said at one point, we began praying. By the way, his mother had just given birth to a little brother. His brother was a couple of months old. And my father said, son, when you write the book, do not over-spiritualize. You tell people exactly what happened. Tell them what the good we did and the bad we did. Because at one point, they came to a fork in the road. God said, turn left. They all looked left, and the road was horrible. And they rationalized. Now, I know you and I never do that. But they rationalized, I don't think God. Do you think God? God would never. And before you knew it, they went the wrong way. And after they went the wrong way, my daddy said many things happened. For 3 days, they ran out of water in the desert. My daddy said about the second evening, they're walking, and my dad is looking at his mother who's holding his little brother, Vasya. And she's weeping. She's got a wet rag, and she's got it at his mouth. And he's saying, Papa, why is Mommy crying? And he says, because she has no milk. She has too much stress, or you can imagine the pressure she was under. She has no milk. Well, what's that rag, he says to him. And he begins to weep as he says, the only fluid your mother has is her own urine. Within a couple of hours, he sees his father take his little brother, wrap him in a blanket, dig a big hole in the sand, and gently lay him and cover the hole. Before my daddy turned 5, he saw one member of his family buried, though he didn't understand death. My daddy said by about the third evening, we were so thirsty, the kids were barely able to walk. The older people were staggering. He said, kids, I remember. We fell on our knees. I fell on my 4.5-year-old knees, threw my 4.5-year-old arms up in heaven, and we all cried out in unison, Father, give us water or else we'll die. You know, when you're in that desperate situation, God hears those desperate prayers. And God speaks to them and said, children, enough prayer. Get up off your knees. Walk straight ahead of you, pitch dark. Walk so many meters, stop, turn left. Walk so many meters, stop, dig. Now, I know people that were there. As these elders began digging in the sand, you know what happens when you're close to water, you're digging in the sand a foot, 2.5 feet, the sand gets cold and damp. They put that sand into rags, wring out the final drop of moisture in the faces of the children. They dug another foot and water gurgled out of the desert floor. My father says to me, I remember, with all the kids ran, we plopped ourselves in that sand in the desert, and we were lapping up sandy water. We were so thirsty. Eventually, all the sand settled, and we replenished our thirst. Before they left that watering hole, they left a sign there that said, anybody walking by this area needing water, drink from this well. God gave it to such and such a group. Unbelievable way that God provided for them. Now, again, I don't have the time to tell you all the details, but miraculously, by the way, when I was writing my book, my daddy said, son, you tell people what we did, but you also tell them that after we realized we were going the wrong way, we came back to the fork in the road and we obeyed God. Church, listen, when you make the wrong turn, do not continue in that path. Everybody says, why is everything bad happening? Go back to that point and make the right decision, amen? And my dad said they did that. Eventually, miraculously, I have no time to tell you, they made their way across the border purely miraculously. When they caught a game across the border, my grandmother with 3 other ladies went to surrounding villages to buy food for the group. Again, details in my book. I don't have time to tell you everything. My grandmother got separated from the group. The leaders felt that they were too close to the border. They've got to move deeper into China. My grandfather said, you can't. We've got to wait for my wife because she didn't come back. No, you've got to trust God, Yaakov. And they pushed on deeper into China. I don't know if they made a mistake or not, but they left without my grandmother. My father said he had never seen his father sadder than that point when they had to pick up all their belongings and head deeper into China without his mother. His father used to always be smiling. Now he was very morose. He was crying, weeping a lot. They hit a huge rice field. You know how they grow rice? They fill a field with water. They were walking waist deep in water and mud. My grandfather would be stumbling, dropping my 4.5-year-old father. Finally, somebody picked him up. The sun's coming up. They're afraid they're going to be spotted. They run out of the rice field. There's a huge ditch right by the road. They all jump in the ditch. Now, if you were to read my book, this is where my book starts, right here. Everybody's in this ditch. My little father's 4.5-year-old nose is overlooking the lip of the ditch. He doesn't know where his mama is. He doesn't know where his papa is. He's looking at the shimmering rice fields, and here's the first words in the book, Papa, where are you? How many times have you asked God that question? where are you? In the midst of this trial, in the midst of this hardship, in the midst of this tragedy, where are you, Papa? We've asked God many times that question. And he asked his brother, Misha, where's Papa? Quiet, they might see us. He points his finger out in the field. Can't you see that's Papa lying out there? My daddy focuses his 4.5-year-old eyes that looks just like Papa. But then he thinks to himself, why isn't he moving? Anyway, eventually the sun comes up. Some of the local people there said, nobody's going to send you back. So 2 guys ran into the field to carry my grandfather out from the field. And I didn't even explain why they were, as they were crossing the field, my grandfather was too weak to leave, so they kind of laid him in a dry area in the field. So they carried him to the road. My father wanted to jump and hug him, but then he notices that he's not moving and his brother is weeping, and the chapter ends with these words. He says, Misha, why are you crying? And the chapter ends with these words, Papa is dead. We don't know to this day why or how my grandfather died out in the rice field, whether he was sick or he died of a broken heart. But before my daddy turned 5, he saw another member of his family dropped into a hole in the ground. He didn't understand death. He didn't know why they were doing that to his daddy. Eventually, they made their way north to the city called Iliyn. It used to be called Kulja, China, in the northwestern part of China in the Xinjiang province. Today, it's called Iliyn. Miraculously, again, more details in the book, my grandmother finds her family 3 weeks later in this huge city of 100,000 people. She had gotten very ill with malaria. She got bitten by a malaria-laden mosquito. People were helping her. They heard there's Russians in that big city, and she found her kids. She was so happy until she found out her husband was dead, and then she was stunned. For 6 months, she lay in bed, sick with malaria. My daddy tells his kids, at that point I was 5, my brother was about 12, and it was our job to feed the family. And we said, what? Daddy, you're 5 years old. How did you feed the family? He said, my brother would teach me Kazakh words. Even though this was China, only Kazakhs lived in this city, this city. And so I would head downtown and I'd stand on the street corner and I'd be putting out my hand, begging for bread. Please, my daddy's dead. My mother is very, very sick. Now, please understand, as a 7-year-old boy, we were stunned. My daddy had to beg for food, and we have all the food we need to eat. My daddy said many times they'd give us strange-looking bread. It would have green hair all over it. We'd eat it and have terrible tummy aches. It was molded bread. Sometimes the dog would snatch the last piece of bread out of our hands and go tearing down the street. We'd run after it, yelling and screaming until it slobbered on the bread, dropped it on the dirt. We'd knock the dirt off and eat it because that's all we had. Many times I knocked on people's doors, please, my daddy's dead, my mommy's sick, please give us bread. For 6 months, he fed his family like that. My daddy said, kids, I'll never forget, I was standing next to my mother's very sick bed. When my brother was looking for bread, I was there with my 2 sisters, and I heard her final words, kids, how can I leave you like this? She closed her eyes and died. And he said, this time they took me and one of my sisters in a wagon. In the back of the wagon was a rickety old box, and my mother was in that box. They took me to that dreaded field again, and I saw the hole in the ground. And he said, I understood. And I began to weep and sob, don't put my mommy in that hole. He said, kids, I was ready to jump off that wagon and jump into that hole with my mommy. My daddy's story really starts right here. Everything I said to you is up to this is really background to his story. It's a story of a little 5-year-old orphan boy living in a big country called China. His older brother and sisters were old enough to work, so they were immediately snatched by other families. Nobody wanted my daddy. The pastor would stand up in the church, please, somebody take Vanya. You remember his mother, Pelageya, and his father, Yakov. Somebody take him. Nobody. They were all poor. They had many, many kids. I can't judge them. Finally, a couple, again, there's more to the story, but I don't know time right now, but a couple that had moved away, they'd come across from Kazakhstan with this group. They were Christians. They had no kids of their own. They were living about 150 kilometers away. The lady heard that there are orphans in the big city church. She sends her husband to the big city church and tells him, find me a little orphan girl. I want her to help take care of my little farm. Takes him 5 days in the horse and the wagon to come to the pastor. You have orphans? Yeah, we do. Great. We want a little girl. Well, we don't have any little girls. We just have 5-year-old Vanya. And this man, like a typical man, looked at my daddy and said, boy, girl, I'll take him. And so he takes my dad in and for the next 5 days, my daddy's on the wagon driving to his new home, and he begins to talk to this man and refer to him as Papa. He can't wait to meet his new mama. And as he's approaching the house, he sees a lady coming out of the house, and he's thinking, that's my new mother. I wonder what happened. He's thinking, why is she so angry looking? And she walks right up to my father. Right before, as she meets him, stares him in the eyes, and in front of my father yells these words at her husband. I thought I told you to bring me a little girl. Why did you bring me this dog? First words he heard out of his new mother's mouth. He's a little dog. It'll be a little mutt for the rest of his life. My daddy lived with this lady. Her name was Masha for 4.5 years. And I'm being very kind with you when I say there were 4.5 years of hell on earth. And I'm being kind when I'm saying that. Masha hated my dad from the day he arrived because he was a little boy. Please understand, I am 7 years old sitting on that down comforter, and my daddy is telling us a story, and we were incensed. My daddy said that she never sent him to school, she never even bought him new clothes, but she did give him a chore. She wouldn't even give him good food. They lived on a farm. She wouldn't even give him milk. She'd give him the leftovers after she made cream or butter, which was just like white water. But she gave him a chore. She had a little barn in the back of the barn. She had chickens. She raised the chickens for the eggs. She'd figure out how many eggs should be laying the night before, and then she'd tell my 5, 6, 7-year-old father, tomorrow you should find 16 eggs. He'd go and begin collecting his eggs, he'd count them, and he's got 13. And she would scream and yell, "You lost." He says, "I looked everywhere. I can't find him." She would grab him by the ear, force him on his knees, pull out a leather strap out of the closet, and severely beat him for not finding 16 eggs. Now listen, at this point, we were ready to kill this lady when we heard this story. We were. As a matter of fact, when my daddy was telling us the story, he thought Masha was still alive, living in Australia. Many of our Russians, like my wife's family, they came out of Russia through China. My wife was born in China, and then from there they immigrated down to Australia. So my father thought Masha was alive in Australia during the telling of the story. Later on, we found out she died in China, but we didn't know that. So I remember as kids, we said, "Daddy, this is not right. It wasn't your fault that you're a little boy and you didn't lose those eggs. Daddy, tell us where she lives. We get in the next airplane, fly to Australia, karate chop her to death, blow her house up. Not right." See? And I'll tell you what, had my daddy simply said these words, he would have affected the rest of our life and would have affected our worship of Jesus. Had he simply said, kids, you're right. Masha was horrible and I hated her. He'd have planted seeds of bitterness into our tender virgin hearts. And we'd have grown up hating a lady we'd have never met. But I'm grateful to tell you that my daddy didn't do that. He would start weeping and sobbing, and he would say, "Kids, don't think evil about Masha. I know she beat me, but at least she was willing to take care of a little orphan boy. And if I were to meet her today, I'd be the first to hug and to thank her." Church, listen to me. If you remember nothing else about this story, listen to this one principle. Never, ever plant seeds of bitterness into the tender virgin hearts of your kids. Never. Always plant seeds of gratefulness. And one day, like we as kids grew up and we publicly thanked our dad for doing that, because we never grew up with bitterness towards Masha. Now, my dad said one day he walked out of the barn. She said 15 eggs. He found 12. He's already weeping, anticipating a beating. And he saw a neighbor lady standing on the other side of the fence. And she was just standing there and looking at my dad. And she kind of did this. And my dad walked over. And she said, "Vanya, why are you crying? I was supposed to find 15. I looked everywhere. I found 12. She's going to beat me. I hear how she beats you. It's not right." So she said, "Wait here." She didn't see Masha. She ran into her own barn, found her own 3 eggs, came and gave them to my daddy. She said, "Just don't tell Masha I gave them to you. I don't want you to be beaten." In the course of 4.5 years, this lady helped my daddy so many times that she literally became like his savior. He'd walk out of that barn scouring the fence line, hoping against hope he would just see the neighbor lady, because if he saw her, he wouldn't get beaten. Church, listen. Sometimes we complicate missions. Sometimes missions, God simply says to you, give a glass of water to somebody in need. And you don't know, when you do a kind thing like that, you don't know, nobody else knows you did it, but God does. And one day, God is going to honor you. You don't believe me? Let me prove it. 1980, Lou and I get married. 83, Lana Marie is born. In 85, we traveled to Australia, speaking in Russian churches all over Australia, getting ready for a large outreach to Moscow. I'm in one particular church. An elderly couple invited us home for a cup of tea. I don't know who they are until she says we lived in China. China, I go. Let me tell you my daddy's story. And as I'm telling her this story, the Lord speaks to me and says, tell her about the lady on the other side of the fence and the eggs. And when I told her that story, this lady had a twinkle in her eye, and she said, "Peter, that lady that gave those eggs to your daddy was me." I jumped up and I hugged her and I wept. And I said, "Thank you for caring for my 5-year-old orphan daddy when nobody else cared." When I came home, I told my daddy, he wept. I mean, what's the probability I'd meet this lady in Australia? It's like God's involved. So, you know, sometimes when you do a kind deed to somebody in the name of Jesus, God sees that and he will honor you. And he will honor you. Now, my daddy formed strange friends when he lived with Masha for those 4.5 years. His closest friends became dark corners. because at least in a dark corner, nobody beat him. Now you can understand the title of my book, which, by the way, I have translated into Russian, Spanish, and Latvian. But it's called Out of the Far Corners, mainly because it took place all around the world, but the word corners also uses, kind of juxtaposes the place where my daddy met Jesus as well. My daddy's story is unbelievable because from Masha, he ended up spending time living with two other families. I have no time to tell you the story here. Eventually, at the age of 13, he began living with his uncle and aunt. Even though he was still in China at the time, he had never gone to school. For the first time, his uncle and aunt sent him to school. He went through a 3-year program where he learned to become a professional cobbler. You know what that is? Nowadays, most young people don't know what that is. That's somebody who actually makes your shoes. So I grew up in the shoe business in San Francisco when I was a kid. So by the age of 16, my dad's a professional cobbler. As a matter of fact, when my dad, even though this was China, the Soviets were still starting revolutions. And the Soviets got this one people to hate this other people. They started a war. They were taking 12-year-old Russian kids right off the streets, giving them rifles and sending them to the front. They grabbed my dad right off the street, 16 years old, and gave him a rifle. My dad said, listen, I'll do anything you want me to do. I'll make boots for you, but don't give me a rifle. I can't kill people. You must, I can't. You must, I can't. So they finally took my 16-year-old father, blindfolded him, and put him in front of a firing squad. They said, we're going to show all the other soldiers what will happen with insubordination. Now, please understand, we're little kids hearing this story. And we said, Daddy, like, what were the last thoughts that flew through your brain, knowing within a second there'd be a bullet there and you'd be dead? I'll never forget my daddy's answer. Kids, he said, I couldn't wait for that bullet. I wanted to go home. I wanted to see Jesus. I wanted to see my mother and my father. As a little kid, I realized there's got to be something about this God. My daddy is not afraid to die for him. I think the next thought that flew through my little 7-year-old brain was, oh my God, I wonder what would have happened to me had my daddy died. Well, my daddy didn't die. Another officer came and said, listen, instead of getting into trouble, I'll write out his orders, send him to the front tomorrow morning without a weapon. And in the morning, he had his orders. Right before he left, another officer came and said, I need a good man to help make me shoes. Their officer said, half of my guys make shoes. Take any of them you want. He said, I want him. And he pointed at my daddy. And guess who won that argument? My daddy never even stood guard with a weapon in his hands in the military. God became his daddy. Now, once he got out of the army, again, more details in the book. Eventually, they made their way all the way across China at the end of the Second World War, down to the Philippine Islands. There was a huge U.S. military base there. My daddy had a pain in his stomach while he was in the military. He didn't know what the problem was. When they came to the big U.S. base in the Philippines after the end of the Second World War, my daddy said, whatever this was in my stomach exploded. And then he said, kids, I can't even begin to tell you the pain I was under. I felt like I was going to explode from the inside out. I could not relieve myself. I couldn't go to the bathroom. The pain was unbelievable. They took me to the nurses. They said, oh, this is way too serious. And my aunt had, his sister, my aunt rented a Jeep, and they drove to another island in the Philippines to bring him to a big hospital. The doctor came up to my father, examined him quickly, turned to his sister and said these words, who do you think I am, God? Your brother's as good as dead. His appendix ruptured from within. That poison has spread throughout his whole body. He's going to die tonight. My aunt began weeping. She wanted to stay with my father all night. My father said, no, go back to the camp. Find every young person who believes in Jesus and get him to pray for me. My daddy said to us kids, 300 young people, Pentecostal, Baptist, Orthodox, began praying for me. And at about 2 in the morning, the nurses were giving me penicillin. They finally stopped because they were wasting their penicillin. They left me to die. And about 2 in the morning, I felt like I had a couple of minutes left and I'm going to be dead. The pain was beyond description when suddenly I felt the presence in the room. I looked around. I couldn't see anybody, but he said, I felt that presence before. I knew who it was. And then he suddenly said, I felt like suddenly, bam, something hit me. A bolt of lightning hit me in my head, and this power surged through my whole body, to my fingertips, to my toes. I had a strong urge to relieve myself. I sat on that stool they gave me, and every ounce of that poison came rushing out of my system. That was not supposed to happen. And he said, kids, I suddenly had absolutely no pain. God had healed me completely. The next morning, the doctor came up to my bedside expecting me to be dead. And he looked at me, and he said, John, what are you doing? You're supposed to be dead. And my dad only knew 4 words in English. Doctor, God healed me. And that doctor stood the longest time with his arms raised. I don't know what happened here. This was not me. This must have been God. Now listen to me, church. From there, they took a ship all the way around Australia to Sri Lanka, to the Red Sea, into the Mediterranean Sea, over to Italy, took a train up to Geneva, took another ship through the Rock of Gibraltar to the Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, on an old airplane, and landed in Paraguay. And that's where my father would meet my mother, out of the far corners. Now listen, very quickly as we end here. I graduated from a very well-known university in California called UC Berkeley. Has anybody heard of that university? I graduated with a double degree in electrical and material science engineering. Can you imagine how proud my daddy was when I flipped my tassel? Because now my daddy said my son is not going to be poor. And when I approached my daddy, and this, I'll tell you why this happened. Because my daddy shared the story about Jesus, and I wanted to worship Jesus for the rest of my life. And I came to my daddy and I said, Daddy, God has called me to be a missionary with an organization called Youth with a Mission. My daddy said, how much did they pay you? I said, Daddy, I think I have to pay them. And my daddy had a hard time understanding. For the first year and a half of my now 41-year career in YWAM, I'd come home every weekend and he'd be praying. He would say to me, son, when are you going to become an engineer? He wanted me to, when are you going to have a salary? He didn't want me to be poor. And this went on for a year and a half. Finally, he came home one day and he just started weeping. Son, I can't live like this. I don't have a peace with what you're doing. Let's go pray. And I'll never forget that prayer meeting. For an hour and a half, my daddy fell on his knees with my mother, wept like a kid. God, why don't I have peace with what my son is doing? And when he got up off his knees, he said, God, speak to me. He looked at me and he said, son, I know why I don't have a peace, because God showed me I, your father, have not been willing to let you go and to release you. Then he said those magical words, son, I bless you and I release you to pursue the very call that God has placed in your life. For the last 41 years, we've been worshiping Jesus, just like Brother George said. As a matter of fact, on Tuesday, Luba and I board a plane, and this is where I desperately need your prayers, because we're flying off to Kamchatka. We're flying off there so we can tell those dear people who desperately need Jesus. We're doing a seminar there on family and on raising kids. We desperately need your prayers. Now, as I close here, we're going to just spend a little time praying here. But I want to read to you something. And this is why I worship Jesus. This is why you should worship Jesus as well. Now, we did already, we honored Jesus today when we took communion. But would you listen to this? And would we just again, as we close here, come up and worship Jesus? At the end of time, billions of people were scattered on a great plain before God's throne. Some of the groups near the front talked heatedly, not with cringing shame before God's throne, but with embittered belligerence. How can God judge us? How can he know about suffering? Snapped a brunette, jerking back a sleeve to reveal a tattooed number from a Nazi concentration camp. We endured terror, beatings, torture, and death. And another group of black men lowered his collar. What about this, he demanded, showing the rope burns. Lynched for no crime but being black. We've suffocated in slave ships, been wrenched from loved ones, toiled till only death gave release. Hundreds of such groups were visible across the plain. Each had a complaint against God for the evil and suffering he permitted in his world. How lucky God was, they seemed to agree, able to live in heaven where all is sweetness and light, without weeping, fear, hunger, or hatred. Indeed, what does God know about man? What does he know about being forced to endure the trials of life? After all, God leads a pretty sheltered life. So each group sent out a leader chosen because he had suffered the most. There was a Jew, a black, an untouchable from India, a person who was illegitimate, a person from Hiroshima, and others who had tasted life's bitterest dregs. At last, they were ready to present their case. It was rather simple. Before God would be qualified to be their judge, he must endure what they had endured. Their decision was that God should be sentenced to live on earth as a man. But because he was God, they set certain safeguards to be sure he would not use his divine powers to help himself. Let him be a Jew. Let the legitimacy of his birth be questioned. Let him champion a cause so just but so radical it brings upon him the hate, condemnation, and destructive attacks of political and religious authorities. Let him be indicted on false charges, tried before a prejudiced jury, and convicted by a cowardly judge. Let him see what it is to be terribly alone and completely abandoned by every living being. Let him be tortured and let him die. And let his death be humiliating. Let it take place beside common criminals while he is jeered at, mocked, and spit on. As each leader announced his portion of the sentence, loud murmurs of approval went up from the great throng of people. But suddenly, after the last one had finished pronouncing sentence, there was a long silence. No one uttered another word. No one moved. For suddenly, all recognized the stark reality. God had already served his sentence. Church, could we stand up? I share this story because I want to honor Jesus. I want to worship Jesus. My daddy shared the story and literally instilled in us a love of Jesus. And church, I don't care what we hear. If we don't have a love of Jesus, nothing else is going to matter. Nothing else that we do on this earth is going to matter. So that's really why I've written this book, just to honor and worship Jesus. It can actually be used even with non-Christian because it's just a story. I don't preach in it. It's a story. But by the end of the story, it's like, maybe I shouldn't get bitter at God because my iPhone broke. Look at what God did in this little boy's life. He didn't get bitter at God. Maybe God can do the same in my life. You know what? I'll be very happy to be here in the front to pray for you. If you want to come, my wife and others would as well. But here's the question. Are we ready to worship Jesus? No matter what circumstances are. My daddy worshiped even through the worst of the worst. He worshiped Jesus.